name is Mike Strausbaugh, and today we're going to talk about the 2-5. Yes, my name is Mike Strausbaugh, and if you Google me, it's going to tell you that I'm a guitar teacher in Colorado. It's not untrue, but I'm also a college music professor and a guitar player, obviously, and a composer and an arranger and a music theorist and a music history nerd and all that good stuff. And today, we're going to be talking about that hallmark of the jazz language, the 2-5. First, let's get some basics out of the way. You may be familiar with some of this information, but if not, here we go. 1. 2-5 simply refers to the 2 and the 5 chord in a key, or the 2nd and the 5th chord in a key. Now, the 2nd or the 5th chord in a key, what does that mean? If we're using the key of C, which we're going to use because there are no sharps and flats and it makes it easier to learn stuff at first, that just means that we start on C, and using the notes in the key of C major alphabetically, C is 1, D is 2, E is 3, F is 4, G is 5, A is 6, B is 7, and C is 1 again, or 8, hence the word octave, like octagon, which I fight in every weekend. What? But if you take those notes and you put them in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the 2 chord is C, D, the 5 chord is C, D, E, F, G, and the 1 chord is 1. Now, this whole video is entitled The 2-5. Not the 2-5-1. That's going to be a huge issue, so pay attention. For now, we're just going to talk about 2 and 5, D and G. So if we use the notes in this key and build the chords, we're going to end up with a chord called D minor 7, which is D. Here's how I have my students build chords. D, skip E, F, skip G, A, skip B, C. This chord is called D minor 7. D, F, A, C. That looks and sounds like this. Now this is a really basic inversion for D minor 7, but if you understand the guitar and you understand that all of our notes are all over the guitar, there are so many different ways to play this, but this is a standard and basic way to learn it first. And we're not going to try to reinvent the wheel. So here's D minor 7. Now if we go to the 5 chord, that's going to be G, B, D, and F. G, B, D, F. That's the 5 chord, and that sounds like this. D minor 7, G7. You may have heard these terms before, the major 2-5 versus the minor 2-5. But it's kind of confusing and it's a little ambiguous. Is the 2 chord major and the major 2-5? What's going on with that? It's actually simpler than that. Major and minor 2-5s, respectively, those are called that because you've got a 2-5 that happens in a major key, and then, similarly, you've got 2-5s that happen in minor keys. That's all it means. Now, because, for instance, C major is very different than C minor, that means that the notes that comprise the C, or the 1, the 2, and the 5 chords, or all the chords, are going to be different. So for the sake of today's demonstrations, we're going to be talking about the major 2-5. But just know that the minor 2-5 essentially works the same way. It sounds different, but the principles are the same. Since we're discussing 2-5s primarily from a jazz standpoint, we're going to be including 7ths on all of our chords. So we're going to take a triad, a root, 3rd, and a 5th, and we're going to tag a 7th on the end. Why, you may ask? Because in the language of jazz, 7th chords comprise our basic vocabulary, or they are the words of the jazz language. While the 2-5 is idiomatic to jazz, it isn't necessarily exclusive to jazz. Kind of. You see, again, when we talk about the 2-5, notice I'm not saying 2-5-1. That's where the 2-5 wants to go. It's aiming at the 1 chord. And historically, in most forms of music, 2 goes to 5 and that goes to 1. So in this case, D minor 7 goes to G7, which typically goes to C. But in jazz, it's understood that the 2-5 doesn't necessarily go to the 1 chord. And in fact, that's kind of the whole basis of this discussion. It's really misunderstood. Keys and scales follow set formulas, and what that means is, if I'm in the key of C major or D major or B flat major, what have you, since they are built the same way, their structure is the same, what this means is Your 1 chord in jazz is always a major chord. Your 2 is always going to be a minor chord. 3 is always minor. 4 is always major. 5 is always major. 6 is always minor. And 7 is always some kind of diminished chord. Now, when I say this, it's with the understanding that I'm talking about major keys. Minor keys are constructed differently, so for the sake of today's discussion, we're just going to be talking about major keys. If you Google 2/5 or the 2/5, what's going to pop up first but Wikipedia? Now, obviously, Wikipedia is an open source website, and so it's not the most credible source, but still think about it this way. Right now, Wikipedia says the 251. If you Google 2/5, it says the 251. There still isn't an entry for the 2/5. Either way, Wikipedia says the 251 is, quote, a common cadential chord progression. True, it's a common chord progression. The word cadential, by the way, or the cadence as it relates to music, is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as, quote, a sequence of notes or chords comprising the close of a musical phrase. Okay, well that's true, but that's like saying the Grapes of Wrath was a book or Led Zeppelin was a band. And I don't patently agree with Mr. Oxford on this one, and you can tell him I said that. A cadence doesn't necessarily have to bring a musical phrase to a close. Hip composers for hundreds of years have known how to take a cadence or a phrase and extend it longer and longer to create tension. Now, I don't mean the kind of tension like this. I mean the kind of tension that's created when you delay expected resolutions. 2 words, Sebastian Bach. Ricky was a young boy, he had a heart of stone. Sorry, 3 words, Johann Sebastian Bach. Go! Regardless, the spirit of the idea remains. 2/5 or 2/5-1 is a common cadential chord progression for centuries and centuries, because when you hear 2 going to 5 specifically, and 5 going to 1, but when you hear 2 go to 5, you are hearing something that's fundamental. You're hearing musical gravity. And Gravity by John Mayer also has a 2/5 in it. Another source that I absolutely love, the Jazz Theory book by Mark Levine. You should get it. I'm not an Amazon affiliate, but you should buy this book. All thrilla, no filla. Now, this book is pretty extensive. And that being said, when Levine discusses basic chord progressions, it happens, as you might imagine, early on in the book. In fact, it's in chapter 2, page 20. And there's one sentence dedicated to this idea. And here, I'm quoting here, it says, 2/5 doesn't have to end with 1. That's all he says about it. And it's true. And he says that 2/5-1 is the most common chord progression in jazz. I don't think I agree with him either. Now, obviously, he's pretty legit here, but I think if you compare the number of 2/5s that resolve to 1 versus the number of 2/5s that resolve anywhere but their respective 1 chord, I don't think it's even close. Okay, that's great, but why 2 to 5? Why not 2 to 3 or 4 to 2 or some other chord to some other chord? That's a really good question, and for that, we need to go to the whiteboard. Behold, the whiteboard. The whiteboard is awesome. Why? Because I get to write stuff on it. And why is that important? Because we're a visual species. So, if we're talking about chord changes and this chord going to that chord, a lot of times it's just this, it's in the air. You're trying to conceptualize stuff and you can't. When you see it happen, man, it works a whole lot better. So, moving in. This right here, this is like a zoomed in quadrant of the circle of fifths. It's written really small there. But this is the circle of fifths. So if you know your circle of fifths, you got C and the G and the D and everything. But we're not using it to discuss keys right now. What we're doing is we're visualizing the interval of a fifth. And why? Because the fifth is the building block of music. And so, the 2-5-1, as you'll see in a second here, it is a microcosm of what's going on in the Western musical world all the time. Dig? All right, so if we're talking about the key of C, C is 1, D is 2, and G is 5, right? Well, if you think of it as 2-5-1 or any combination thereof, you may be missing the actual relationships between these chords. If we understand that fifths want to resolve in a certain way, then it's going to help us understand not just 2-5-1, but chord progressions in general. Here's my target, which again, we don't really have to go to, but that's ultimately the target. That's my 1 chord. And if you go 1/5 clockwise, that's the 5 chord. Now that's going to make sense because C is 1, G is 5. C, D, E, F, G. Makes perfect sense. But what you may not be hip to is the fact that if I start on G and I go up a 5th from there, G, A, B, C, D. That's going to be my 2 chord. So if you realize that the 2 isn't just the chord that comes after C, the 2 is the 5 of the 5, then going to the 1 chord. I want you to conceptualize, think about it like a slinky going downstairs. Or waterfalls, if you will. Same idea. Because of the science and the math behind music, which is another conversation, D really wants to go to G. And G really wants to go to C. And that's when we're just talking about the actual notes. So, here's D. D goes down to G. I can't sing that low. D goes down to G, which goes to C. So if you hear that bass line enough, you think, okay, I've heard that before. Dum, dum, dum. We've heard it so much, maybe we've never questioned, why is that so common? That's the question that needs to be asked, and that's what we're going to answer. So this note, D, if we ran these notes through oscilloscopes, which are magical 20th century pieces of technology that measure sound waves, you would actually find out that the note D is a huge part of the note G, such that it's like a magnet. D wants to go to G. Similarly, G is a huge part of C. That's why this really likes to go to here, that likes to go to here, just by themselves. 2, 5, 1. Now, when I add the other notes in to the chords, let me scoot over here. Yep. When I add these other notes in, it's like filling in some of the cracks. So the fifths that we were talking about, D to G to C, these are these massive gravity blocks, if you will, that are attracted to each other. D to G, G to C. They want to go that way anyway, right? So fifths have massive gravity to each other. But then, when we look at the other notes here, if you look at it, you're going to see some similarities here. First, identify common tones. Common tones are what they sound like. They are notes that are common between these 2 chords. And sure enough, half of the notes in D minor 7 are also in G7. Pa. This note right here specifically, F. Man, that's a big note in the key of C. Because on the other side of C over here, that's why this is called the subdominant. It's the dominant below C. That note is a pillar in the key of C, and it has massive gravity. So what we're doing here in the 2 and the 5 chord is we're setting up We're thinking ahead. We're setting up a resolution. Now, I'm going to write the C chord here with the understanding that we don't have to go there, but just to give you an idea. And what I'm not going to do, I'm not going to put a seventh on that, and there's a reason. But if you look here, F is in this chord. It stays when we go to the G chord, and then when 5 goes to 1, it goes down. And how far is it from F to E? Show of hands. Who said whole step? Out, get out. No, I'm just kidding. It's a half step. It's one of our 2 half steps in our key. As I tell my students, the difference between a whole step and a half step, it's not just a fret, dude. Half steps, it's kind of a contradiction in terms. Half steps are huge because they're so small. If you consider the gravity between these notes, half steps between notes, they're like gravity wells. In other words, in any key, like in this key, F and E, they're a half step apart. They're always pulling on each other. F wants to go to E, and E wants to go to F. So F, when we set it up here, it's waiting. It's just waiting to resolve. Here's the F. I'm going to do it up here, actually. Right here. There's the F. Then it stays when I go to the G7 chord. Whoops. And then it goes to here when we resolve to 1. But again, we don't have to. Listen to that again. F is here, then it's here again, and then it goes down a half step. And man, do my ears love half steps. So do yours. Here they are again. Da, da, da. It sounds awesome, right? And when it resolves, yada, our ears go, that's nice. You love it. You might not even know it, but you love it. So that's going on between 2 and 5. Okay, we got these common tones. D is, it's filling in a supportive role. It'll go where you need it to. More on that later. But then if we look at these notes, there's something going on here too. So these 2 notes stay put, right? But these 2 notes both resolve. We call it resolution by step, or you may have heard the term voice leading. The notes in a chord, just think of them as voices. Notes, voices, same thing. Dig? Okay, so D and F stay put. But then the A, typically, if we're talking about smooth voice leading, which just means the smallest distance you can resolve notes, G or A is going to go to G. Da da. Whoop, sorry, wrong notes. Ba ba. That's fine. That's also, we're going to talk about that later. But it's this one here, C going to B. How far is it from C to B? Who said whole step? No, seriously, get the hell out. It's a half step. It's our other half step in this key. We got 2 half steps in any key, and fifths and half steps make, they're the gravity in our musical solar system that is our key. Seriously. So here's one of them. F is the same between these 2 chords, then it resolves down to E if you go to 1. But between the 2 and the 5 chord, we have C going down to B. And that's huge, man, because this is the note we're ultimately trying to get to, even if we don't. We go C, then we go down to what's called the leading tone, and it's called that for a reason, dude. And then if you go back to a C chord, it goes back up to C. So we have this. Whoa, that's not what we have. We have C, go down to B, and then back to C. Now in jazz it resolves differently, but we're talking about basic resolutions first. Isn't this cool? All these notes are doing these things all at once. It's kind of like a choreographed dance between 4 dancers. And then they go to here, these 2 stay put, and these 2 move by step or by half step, and you go from this chord, D minor 7, to G7. Beautiful stuff, man. And like I said, the 2-5, it really presents itself here because these are the chords that set up 1. If 1 is Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen. Or if this is Jordan, this is Pippen. Either way, this is the guy with all the tension in it. This is the setup guy. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm glad you asked because when we have this set of notes, which is really similar to this set of notes, we have to understand that a minor 7th chord or a major 7th chord, they sound very stable. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is, this interval right there, D to A, is a perfect 5th. Circle of 5ths. That's like a bedrock. D and A do this, and it's the foundation of our chord, and it's really stable. You might think major chords sound happy and minor chords sound sad, for instance, but they're not unstable. They don't sound weird or out there. So that's a perfect 5th, a stable 5th, a power chord, if you will. This, F to C, is another one. So we've got two very stable sounds, D to A and F to C. When you play them in a row like that, you might not see it or hear it, but it's a power chord and another power chord. It's very stable sounding. But then we take this very stable sound and it's like we compress it. The C drops down to B. A going down to G, that's going to sound good. That's fine. It doesn't create that much tension in and of itself. But this going down to B, that does, man, because we've still got a perfect 5th here. But this right, oh God, there's a lot of lines here. This right here, B and F. What's that interval? It's a 5th. B, C, D, E, F. Okay, everything checks out. But wait a moment. Here's B. Here's F. Ugh. Actually, our ears are somewhat anesthetized to this in the 20th/21st century because we've heard it forever and ever. It's the sound of the blues. We've heard that diminished 5th, which is what this is, so much, but there's no doubt that's a tense sound. So the chord before it had stable sound. One of the notes moves, the C moves down to B. We get this tension, it's like a ball of tension. We've taken a D chord, or this chord, and we've kind of squished it. These notes kind of moved in, so to speak. So visualize taking a stable sound and actually compressing it. And thinking about a compressed sound, it sounds tense, right? It sounds like this. Ugh, I'm making that face. It's like we've squished it, and what does it want to do? It's like take a balloon and squeeze it. It wants to pop back out, right? That's what happens when you resolve it. Well, I'll add that in here. B wants to go up again a half step to C. F wants to go down a whole or half step to E. What? It's like magic. Here's the tension, B and F, and they resolve to C and E. Ah. That's magical. But it's art, it's language, it's science, it's math. It's the 2-5. Blues for Alice is what's called a jazz blues. It was written by a good friend of mine named Charlie Parker. He was an alto saxophonist in the 1940s and 50s, and he was real good.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
This is an amazing tune, am I right? Yeah, I'm right. And in those 12 measures, there are no less than 8 2-5s. And how many of those 8 2-5s go to their corresponding one chord? 3. There's the one that goes between measures 4 and 5. That's the C minor F7 to B flat 7. And then you see G minor 7 go to C7, go to F twice. From 9 and 10 to 11, and then again at the turnaround. And that's it. So if we look at Blues for Alice, I hope it kind of illustrates the point that the 2-5 itself is more important than 2-5-1. I mean, Blues for Alice is kind of evidence of that, right? And hopefully our time at the whiteboard has illustrated some stuff for you as well. And here's what I want you to think about. The 2-5 is a compound word. or a compound chord, but essentially it's the same idea. It's the 2, it's the 2, it's the 5, but it's the 2-5. Okay, the first part's stable, 2 chord. The 5 part is like the 2 chord, but squished, if you will. Stable, compressed, and boom, it wants to resolve. It doesn't have to resolve to the 1 chord, but again, that's what makes, well, one thing that makes jazz so interesting is how hip composers and improvisers navigate 2-5s that go, quote unquote, where they're not even supposed to. And also, if we think of 2-5s as compound words or compound chords, that means we get to process music or ideas in larger chunks. We're not thinking chord, 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 chord. And you don't want to be thinking on the bandstand anyway, but if you're thinking about chord, 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 you're going to get lost really quickly. If you're able to kind of relax a little bit and see the music in larger chunks, you're going to be able to navigate them better. That's got to make sense too, right? But why doesn't it go to 1? Why do 2-5s not go to 1? Or why does the 2-5 not have to go to 1, I should say? Think of the 1 chord as the obvious destination. The 2-5 and maybe the chord progression that comes before it, that's the road trip. Think about any good road trip, right? A road trip isn't about the destination. It's about how you get to the destination. 1 is obvious. That's the least interesting chord, if you ask me, in a key. It's how you get there that makes it more interesting. And here we are. This video was a ton of fun for me to do. And I encourage you, I implore you, to try to find 2-5s on your own. Get a real book, go through and put brackets around any 2-5s that you find. Keep your mind engaged and start looking for these compound words, these compound chords, the 2-5. I also encourage you to hit subscribe and like and visit me at my website, MikeStrausbaugh.net. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I hope to see you soon.